For centuries, culture in San Marino has not been the focus of attention. It grew slowly, amid preserved documents, improvised halls, fragile theatres, and initiatives born more out of necessity than ambition. Yet, precisely through this process of tentative steps and cautious choices, the Republic has built something solid, a cultural system capable of enduring over time. In this episode, we will tell the story of how San Marino learned to preserve, represent, and showcase its identity, right after the intro. Welcome to the oldest Republic. I'm Carlotta. Come join me in this amazing adventure. Enjoy the episode. The first traces of organized cultural life in San Marino appear between the 16th and 17th centuries. It is not yet a rich artistic production, but rather a community that feels the need to preserve documents, writings, and books. There is an archive. Music is practiced in religious contexts, and as early as 1589, the documents of the Prince and Sovereign Council, that is, the Parliament, mentions activities related to comedy. It is an essential culture, more functional than expressive, but deeply linked to the functioning of the state. The first mention of the archive dates back to the mid-16th century. In the centuries that followed, the archive became the heart of San Marino's institutional memory, preserving civil and judicial documents and assuming a historical, administrative, and notarial function. As early as the end of the 16th century, inventories, revisions, and regulations were introduced. Preserving documents meant ensuring continuity and legitimacy for the republican system. However, the real turning point came a few centuries later. In the 19th century, after the unification of Italy, San Marino felt the need to strengthen its international image. It was the same desire for modernity, if we can call it that led, for example, to the construction of the government building, as we saw in episode 11 of this podcast. Therefore, in 1862, on the occasion of the signing of the treaty with the Kingdom of Italy, the Republic entrusted the statesman and historian Luigi Cibrario with the task of reorganizing the archives, among other cultural initiatives. His classification system, functional and modern for its time, provided the institution with its first organized structure, even though it did not systematically address the oldest materials. The limitations of this system soon became apparent. About 20 years later, Carlo Malagola was appointed to the above task, and in 1891 he completed a fundamental reorganization and published a work that was to remain the main guide to the documents in the archive for a long time to come. A second project, begun in 1910, remained unfinished due to his sudden death. The history of the archive takes us directly to the mid-20th century, when the archive was transferred from the government building to a new location, namely Palazzo Valloni, another historical building in the city centre, which was restored after being damaged in the 1944 bombing. In the new premises, the archive and the library were finally close together and their cultural function was strengthened. However, it must be admitted that the administrative aspect still prevailed, and only in 2012 a law reorganized cultural institutes and reaffirmed the historical value of book heritage. We have talked about the archive and mentioned the state library. The latter is more recent, and the first official document concerning it dates back to 1839, with the purchase of the library of the widow of Antonio Onofri. Initially without access to the public, it found a permanent home in Palazzo Valloni in 1846 and opened to the public one day a week from 1858 onwards. Here too, Cibrario's intervention was decisive. Donations of books and private collections rapidly increased the heritage, but often without any particular order. After several failed attempts, the first real reorganization took place in 1890. Inventories and files were drawn up, allowing the library to reopen to the public in 1894. However, difficulties persisted. There was a lack of space, staff, and a consistent policy. The damage caused by the war in 1944 aggravated the situation, and it was not until the 1980s, with its separation from the museum and a new service-oriented concept, that the library began a process of modernization. Since then, the State Library has been integrated into library networks and the cultural institutes, fully assuming the role of a national institution. Culture is not just about printed paper. Luigi Cibrario was well aware of this, and once again, under his initiative, the project for San Marino's first museum was developed in 1862. The project was inspired by the model of the 19th century encyclopedic museum, conceived as a place capable of collecting and organizing works from the most diverse fields of knowledge. To build the first collections, Cibrario turned to influential figures of his time, inviting them to donate materials to the Republic. Indeed, just a few years later, the first contributions from external benefactors arrived. The donated items are placed in Palazzo Valloni, and in the following years, the number of donors from various European countries increases. The collections grew rapidly but unevenly. Archaeological finds, exotic curiosities, antique paintings, furniture, fossils, scientific instruments. It is a rich and fascinating collection, but lacking any real order and, above all, still disconnected from the territory of San Marino. In the 1880s, as restoration works began on Palazzo Valloni, the growth of the collections made it necessary to rethink their location. At the end of the century, the first rooms of the government museum were inaugurated. The materials were finally organized and classified into sections, from paintings to coins, from Egyptian, Greek, and Roman artifacts to medieval and modern objects. It is the official birth of the State Museum. At the beginning of the 20th century, donations continued, albeit with less intensity, and a new focus on materials related to the history of the territory emerged. On the one hand, numismatic collections grew, while on the other, archaeological finds were sought that could tell the story of the Republic's most ancient origins. The 1909 regulations governing access to museums and libraries helped to consolidate the image of a cultural institution that was open and accessible to the public, even though traumatic situations were certainly not lacking. If you have been following us so far, you will no doubt remember that in the last episode of the podcast, we discussed at length the discovery and subsequent sale and dispersal of the so-called Domagnano treasure, which took place in the last decade of the 19th century. This certainly represents a dark chapter in the history of cultural heritage conservation in San Marino. The Republic lost what is considered to be the most important archaeological find on its territory. Looking back, this episode highlights the need to protect and promote our historical and artistic heritage. The people of San Marino learned from their mistakes, and this process of growing awareness led, in 1990, to the enactment of a law protecting antiquities and art objects, which complemented the management of collections with a broader reflection on the preservation of cultural heritage. In 1937, alongside the reorganization of the library, Gino Zani, whom we discussed at length in the 10th episode of the podcast, proposed a radical transformation of the museum. For the first time, the institution is structured around a real painting gallery, accompanied by numismatic and archaeological collections and memorabilia from the escape of Giuseppe Garibaldi. Not even the bombing of 1944 could halt this progress. The museum was severely damaged, but Zani oversaw its restoration, enabling it to reopen to the public. In the post-war period, the climate of reconstruction fostered a season of great vitality. In 1956, the Museum of Ancient Sidearms was established in the second tower, and in the same year, the San Marino Figurative Art Award was launched, followed by the San Marino Art Biennials that were very popular, in particular in the 1960s. At the same time, museum projects multiplied. In 1966, the St. Francis Museum and Picture Gallery was opened. A few years later, the Museum of Ancient Firearms and the Philatelic and Numismatic Museum were established, and in 1980, the idea of a museum dedicated to contemporary art took shape, leading to the creation of the National Gallery of Modern Art, which found its permanent home in 2018. Since 2014, the management of public museums has been centralized within San Marino's cultural institutes. In the following years, new museums were added, such as the Museum of the Emigrant and the Museum of Natural History, completing a mature and well-structured museum scene. This journey through the history of San Marino's culture would be incomplete without mentioning entertainment in the Republic, which has a unique and fascinating history. Indeed, its history began early on, but progressed in small steps. As early as the 17th century, there was a music school linked to the parish church and the first traces of theatrical activities, which was still sporadic and entrusted to local initiatives. In the 18th century, even before having dedicated building, performances were also held inside the government building. It is a culture that adapts, that makes use of what is available, but that slowly takes shape. The decisive step came in 1772, when the construction of a theatre in the city of San Marino was approved. The works were only completed in the early 19th century, and the result was a fragile building lacking many essential services. Yet that theatre marks a change of pace. Entertainment becomes a permanent feature in public life. During the 19th century, the building was improved, and at the same time, Borgo Maggiore, another township in the San Marino territory, began to develop its own theatre. The construction of the theatre was the result of direct participation by citizens, supported by the state, and culminated in 1872 with the inauguration of the Concordia Theatre. Between the late 19th and the early 20th century, theatrical activities spread throughout the territory. Amateur dramatic societies were established, plays were staged in school and colleges, and theatre became a tool for education and socializing. Theatres were renovated several times, endured the hardships of war, and in the post-war period initially struggled to find a stable function again. But performances never stopped. On the contrary, from the second half of the 20th century onwards, the offer grew. The number of societies increased, new spaces were created, more regular seasons were organized, and theatre became a constant presence in the cultural life of the Republic. In the post-war period, San Marino also experienced a brief but significant period of cinema activity. Mount Titano became a natural setting for historical productions, and cinema contributed to spreading an evocative and somewhat romanticized image of the Republic. Over the decades, cinema has become increasingly part of regular programming. Cinemas have opened, film festivals have been organized, and summer events have taken place in townships' squares. Since the 1980s, a more structured cultural policy has supported both theatre and cinema, bringing local offerings closer to Italian circuits. In recent decades, however, the system has changed again. Some cinemas have closed, others have been renovated and converted, and digital technology has profoundly reshaped the way films are enjoyed. Certainly, in a short time, we will be able to tell you about a new chapter in this story that is yet to be written. But building a shared cultural life is not just about images. Alongside the screen, often in the same spaces and at the same times, another language has always accompanied the San Marino community, namely music. Music follows a parallel path. The earliest traces refer to the religious and popular sphere, but it was mainly between the 19th and the 20th century that musical practice became established. The band becomes a regular feature at ceremonies and in community life, while folk music accompanies festivals, fairs, and community events. As had happened with cinema, the 20th century was the century in which music became increasingly part of everyday life, intertwining with political and social life. From an initial choral experience, a music school develops, grows, and takes shape, obtains official recognitions, and becomes a true national benchmark. The San Marino Music Institute was established, driven by the energetic maestro Cesare Franchini Tassini, a pioneering figure in the San Marino music scene. New groups, ensembles, and orchestras are forming around the institute, capable of organizing events of an increasingly high standard and engaging with the outside world. At that point, music also becomes fully integrated into the cultural policies of the state, completing a process that had begun centuries earlier with small, fragile, but decisive initiatives. To summarize, archive, library, museums, theatres, music. Different tools introduced at different times, but all linked to the same need: to give public form to the memory, creativity, and collective life of a small republic. Over time, these institutions have ceased to be mere places of preservation and have become spaces for participation, storytelling, and discussion. We will continue to discuss stories and comparisons in the next episode of the podcast, as always in a week's time here on Storia in Flanella. That's all for today. We will be back in a few days with the final episode of The Oldest Republic. Thank you very much for listening, and until the next time, goodbye.